Hello and welcome to the video on interface and navigation in Blender. In this video, I'm going to give you an introduction to Blender's interface. I'm going to show you how to navigate the 3D space, how to select and deselect objects, and finally how to customize Blender to work a little bit better for you. So first of all, quickly to tour the interface, let's just real quick look at each of the different components here. So the first and most prominent one, of course, is the 3D view. Here, this is our 3D viewport where we're going to be doing the majority of our work, everything from modeling to animating to rendering. The majority of your 3D editing will be done within this view. Within the viewport, we have a couple of small subcomponents. The first one is the toolbar here on the left-hand side, where you're going to find a series of tools that are relevant to your general selection. By default, you have a cube selected here, and I'm going to show you the selection tools here in just a moment. And if you then use any one of these tools, those will then be applied to your current selection. So I can do things like transform the cube, I can duplicate, I can delete, I can set the shading type, etc., etc. So we've got a variety of tools that apply to our current selection. We can toggle this toolbar on or off simply by pressing the T key. That will just hide the toolbar, or if we press it again, it will reveal the toolbar. You can also hide it simply by left-click and dragging on the border here until it toggles away, or you can then reveal it with the little plus icon right here. Similar to the toolbar, on the right-hand side of the viewport, we've got another little plus sign, which if we bring that up, brings up the viewport properties. And this gives us a series of settings that are relevant either to our current object selection or to the actual viewport. So things like the current location of our selection, we've got a grease pencil, we can set the lens focal length of our current perspective camera, and so on. So we've got a variety of settings that apply to the 3D view. Next, above that, we have the info bar. The info bar is where you're going to find things like your file menu, your add menu, your render menu, your window menu, and so forth. We can also do things like if you have multiple render engines installed for Blender, we can change the render engine type, which we're going to be looking at this later down the road here in just a bit. You can also find some info reports about your current scene. So for example, I can see that my current scene has 8 vertices, 6 faces, 12 triangles, and 3 objects, one of which is selected. I can also see the amount of memory that is installed. And in the case that this panel is too short, since, for example, I'm working at 1280 by 720 right now during this recording, if I simply hold down my middle mouse button and drag, I can then pan this view to the right to see the rest of the info. Below that, we have our outliner. The outliner is the hierarchy of our current scene. So within my scene, I can see that I've got render layers, a world, I've got my camera, my cube, my lamp. Within each one of these, I can simply select them by left-clicking on each one of them. And again, we're going to talk more about selection in a moment. Within each one of these, I can also hide them either within the 3D view simply by pressing the eye icon, or I can lock them such that I can no longer select that object at any point, and I can also remove that object from the render. So if I don't want to delete an object, but I want to prevent it from contributing to a render, or perhaps just hide the visibility, I can simply click the camera icon. Below the outliner, we have our properties panels. Here is where you're going to adjust everything from your render resolution to your anti-aliasing settings, settings specific to your render engine. We've got scene-specific settings. We've got environment settings, object settings, constraints, lamp data, texture data, physics data, so forth and so on. So anything that is relative to our specific properties will generally be inside here. This will be everything from your environment to your materials to your physics and so on. To the left of here, below the viewport, we have our timeline, and our timeline is for the animation time. Let me just move this up just a little bit. Any one of these panels, you can adjust the size simply by dragging your mouse in between them to adjust the size. And using the left mouse, we can simply left-click and drag to scrub through time within the timeline. You can see our current frame set right here. You can also see the current frame and time here. So right now I'm on frame 147. My total frame count is 1 to 250. So this is if I'm doing animations, then my current animation would be a total of 250 frames long. I've got my playback controls here to the right side. To the left, I have some menus for adjusting things like playback settings, frames, markers, the view settings, and so on. And finally, the last thing that I forgot to talk about are the settings along the bottom of the viewport. So the bottom of the viewport, you've got things like your view menu for changing the view from top, left, right, changing cameras, setting, view all, playing back the animation. In our select menu for selecting all objects by type, such as selecting all cameras, all lattices, all meshes. We've got our object menu for changing things, the data, hiding objects, moving them to a different layer, snapping them to another place, and so forth. A lot of settings for specific objects themselves. We've got the ability down here to change the mode for our current object. So here I can change between object mode, edit mode, sculpt mode. We're going to be looking at these here in just a little bit down the road. We've also got our viewport shading, so I can change between bounding box, wireframe, solid, and textured. We've got things like our current pivot point. We've got our viewport manipulators, so if we don't like using the little manipulators here, which again we're going to look at in a bit, you can toggle those on and off. And then lastly, we also have our viewport layers. So similar to many applications that allow us to work in layers, Blender's viewport layers work in here. So currently I'm on layer 1, and I can switch to layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, so forth. So that is the basics of the interface. Now let's go ahead and look at how to navigate the 3D view. And navigating the 3D view, first of all, we can rotate, pan, or zoom. So we can rotate the 3D view simply by middle click and dragging. This is your third mouse button by default, and I can just rotate the view like this. If I wish to pan the view, I can simply hold down my shift key and middle click and drag. And if I want to zoom the view, I can just use my scroll wheel to zoom in or zoom out. For selecting objects, there's many different ways we can select objects in Blender, and I'm just going to talk about a couple of them right now. First and foremost, you can select them from the outliner here, simply by left-clicking on them, as I showed you previously. So left-clicking on the camera, you can see that the camera is now highlighted in orange to showcase that it is selected. If I then select the cube by left-clicking on it, you'll see it's highlighted in orange. If I want to select multiple objects, I can simply hold down the Shift key and left-click on the lamp. You can see it's now selected as well. You will also notice that the cube has now been shown in a darker orange outline. This means that it is selected, but it is no longer my active selection. The active selection, or you can think of it as your primary selection, is showcased with the bright orange. So again, if I hold down Shift and select the camera, then it's highlighted in orange and the other two objects are shown in a darker orange. Now, one oddity in Blender that throws a lot of people off initially is that its selection within the 3D viewport is different than, say, selecting from the outliner. And that is that selecting in Blender by default is done with the right mouse button. And so if I just simply right-click on an object in the 3D view, that will select it. I can select another object or another object. If I hold down Shift, I can select two objects. And then if I want to remove an object from a selection, say if I want to remove the camera, I can hold down Shift, right-click on it to make it my active selection, and then right-click again, and it will remove that selection and just leave my cube selected. Now, we have the ability to change the selection tools in Blender to make it a little bit more user-friendly, which go ahead and leads us into the customizing Blender for you. So far we've talked about just the basics of, the different components within the interface, navigating the 3D view, and selecting objects via the outliner and the 3D view. Now let's go ahead and jump right into customizing Blender a little bit. So we're going to go up here to the File menu, and then User Preferences. Inside the user preferences, we have a variety of panels. We've got the interface, editing, input, add-ons, themes, file, system, and each one of these allows us to change a variety of settings. For the time being, I only care about the input section. So in the input section is where we're going to control things like which mouse button is used to select, any hotkeys we want to change. So first of all is we do have presets. So you can see here on the left side, we have presets for these settings. These are basically our navigation and selection settings. By default, it's set to Blender. We can also choose the Maya preset if we wish, which you'll notice changes the select width to left, changes the zoom style to horizontal dolly, and it inverts the zoom direction. If we just choose this back to Blender, we can also just customize this any way we want to select with the left mouse button or the right mouse button. Over on the right side, these are all of our keyboard shortcut sections. So there's a lot of hotkeys within Blender. For example, if I wanted to go in and look at the hotkeys for rotating around the 3D view, I could toggle down the 3D view, then 3D view global, and here we can see rotate view, move view, zoom view, and all of the other hotkeys that are involved in the global 3D view, such that they affect the 3D view no matter which working mode you're currently in. Now, I'm not going to worry about these for the time being. I'm just going to show you that you can change your mouse presets using this right here between Blender and Maya, or you can customize them on your own, or you can change your hotkey presets right here from Blender's default to the 2012 experimental key set that's currently in development, or the Maya preset. For demonstration purposes, I'm going to go ahead and just keep it on default and default. Lastly, if you have changed some of your settings, just be aware that you want to save your preferences. So be sure to click Save User Preferences or Save User Settings before you close out Blender, or you're going to have to come in and change that again. Last thing that I want to show you is the themes. So in the themes panel, we have the ability to change the color of Blender. So by default, we've got all of our default colors here, but we've got a variety of other themes that we can choose from. Everything from a 3D Studio Max theme to Back to Black to a Maya or Modo theme or a ZBrush theme, and a variety of others that we can use to change the appearance of all of the different colors within Blender, just to make it more user-friendly, whether that's easier on your eyes or just personal preference. You can, of course, also just create your own preset by clicking the plus sign, name that preset, and then go in and change any of the colors you wish by changing the section here. So here within the 3D view, I can see all of the colors that apply to the 3D view, and I can go in and modify each and every one of those. Now, as you can see, of course, if you want to start from scratch, it can be very, very time consuming to go in and change everything to be nice and consistent and well done, but you have the ability to if you wish. And that's it for the basics of the interface and navigation. Let's go ahead and move on to the modeling. Welcome to the modeling section of our Blender Basics course. In this section, I want to show you how to use the transform tools, how to use the object tools, the difference between object mode and edit mode, working with different mesh selection and editing tools such as subdivide, extrude, inset, and then finally, how to use modifiers on mesh objects. So first of all, let's take a look at just adding and removing objects from your scene. By default, in Blender, we have 3 objects in our scene. We have a camera, we have a cube, and we have a lamp. Of these objects, we have 3 different types. Obviously, we have a lamp object, a camera object, and a cube object, or that cube, more specifically, is a mesh object. And when we work with modeling, generally we're going to be working with mesh objects, and that's what I'm going to keep the focus on for the time being. If we want to remove an object from a scene, such as if I want to delete the camera and say the lamp, I can simply use the toolbar right over here and choose Delete. I can also just simply press the X key or the delete key over my 3D view. Now note that the backspace key does not work, but if you have a full-size keyboard, the delete key does. Generally, Blender has a paradigm of sorts where you generally use the right hand on your mouse, the left hand on your keyboard. Thus is why you find a lot of the hotkeys on the left-hand side of the keyboard. So we're just going to hit X and choose Delete. Next, I can select my cube with my right mouse button. And again, using the toolbar, as I showed you in the previous video, we have access to a lot of the tools that are specific to this object. So I can translate or move the object. Anytime I activate a transform mode, whether that is translate, rotate, scale, or any other mode such as that, I can then cancel that transform, or actually first I can confirm the transform simply by left-clicking or pressing the Enter key, or I can cancel that transform simply by pressing the right mouse button or the escape key. So as I'm doing this, if I just hit the escape key, then that will cancel that. So we have our translate, rotate, and scale. We also have the ability to do each of those from the 3D viewport using the manipulators. So here with the manipulators, if I just grab my Z-axis arrow for the blue one, I can move that up and down. I can move it forward and back, or left and right. If I want to change the mode of the transform widgets, I can go down here to the header of the 3D view and change the modes here. So by default, it's on translate. I can set it to rotation, giving me rotation widgets, or I can set it to scale to give me scale widgets. Now you'll notice by default, these widgets are all done in global space. So even though my cube has been rotated, if I were to scale it along the x-axis, it scales it globally, not locally. So you can change your space down here, the orientation from global to local to gimbal to normal or view. So if I change it to local, you'll notice that the widget is now aligned with my object, and I can now scale it locally along that axis. If I want to use multiple widgets, I can simply hold down the Shift key and toggle these on or off such that I can use any configuration that I want. If you're like me and you don't like to use the widgets at all, then you can simply turn the widgets off with this button here, or simply by pressing Control Space over the 3D view. With those widgets off, or with them on, you can also activate any one of these transform modes via the hotkeys. Now, they're quite easy to remember in Blender as they're using the first letter of the word. So, for example, if we want to translate or grab, as it's generally called in Blender, I can simply press the G key, and any selected object will then be put into translate mode, at which point I can either then confirm it or cancel it at any point, confirming with the return key or left mouse button, canceling with the right mouse button or escape. I can also rotate it with R, or scale with S. So again, that's G for grab, R for rotate, and S for scale. During any one of these transforms, if I want to lock it to an individual axis, I can simply activate the transform, such as grab, and then press either X, Y, or Z on my keyboard to activate that axis constraint. So if I press X, it will then be locked to the global X axis. If I press X a second time, it will be locked to the local axis, or more specifically, whichever axis is defined here. So if I set this to view, and I hit G and X, it first locks it to the global axis. If I press X again, it locks it to the view x-axis. So the secondary click, or secondary press with the axis constraints, sets it to whichever orientation is defined here. For the time being, I'm just going to set this back over to global. Now, one thing to note that is a little bit different is that if this is set to global, such as default, and I hit G and then X twice, it will set it to local. So your second press will always default back to the local orientation or whatever else other than global is defined right here. So those are our transform tools. We've also got a variety of other tools here that we can use, such as if we want to duplicate our object or delete our object. If we want to change the location of this object via the numeric input, we can simply hit N to bring up the properties panel, and underneath the transform section here at the very top, we can go ahead and set the very specific location and the rotation. So for example, if I wanted to just zero these back out, I could just go 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and 0, and that would reset each of them. I could also reset the scale by simply setting each one to 1, like so. And now I've reset my object entirely. Now you can also do any one of these, such as if I rotate the object and I want to then reset the rotation, I can simply hit Alt-R, or I can reset the location and the scale by hitting Alt-G and Alt-S, and that will reset those back to 0, 0, and 1. So that's working with the actual object itself. But what if we wanted to, say, add another object? Well, we can do that one of two ways. We can either go up here to the Add menu from the 3D view, or within the 3D view, we can simply press Shift-A, and then we can choose any one of our objects. Now for today, since we're working with just meshes, I'm going to ignore the rest of these for the time being. We could then choose any one of our other objects that we wanted. First of all, let's delete our cube. So we'll hit delete, and we'll just confirm the delete. And then let's hit Shift-A, add in a mesh, and let's do a cylinder. Now, there's two things to note. First of all, we have some settings that we can apply to this cylinder, which you can find down here at the bottom of the toolbar in what's known as the operator panel. If this panel does not show, such as like this, then you can simply click the plus sign and it will show right up. You can also access this panel at any time by pressing the F6 key, and that will pop it up right in the 3D viewport. Now, this is called the operator panel because this panel is what is going to show the settings relative to the last operation you performed. So that operation could be adding an object, transforming an object, deleting an object, or any number of other things. So if you wish to adjust the settings, say on this cylinder, you need to adjust them before you do anything else, or you're no longer going to have access to those settings and will need to start over. But since I've just now added my cylinder, I can go ahead and change, say, the vertex count down to 12. I could increase the radius to 2. I can choose the cap fill type between N-gon, triangle fan, or nothing. I prefer the N-gons. I could go ahead and align it to the current view, but I won't in this case. And then I could reset the location. But you may wonder, why is the location offset? And this is time to introduce one of the most commonly used tools in Blender that is also the most ambiguous to new users, and that is the 3D cursor. The 3D cursor is the little crosshair-like thing that you see right here. The 3D cursor can be positioned at any time in the 3D view simply by using your non-select tool. So basically your activate mouse button. So by default, this is your left mouse button. If you've changed your select mouse to your right mouse button, then setting the 3D cursor will be done with the right mouse button. So if I just left click, by the way, that's referred to as the action mouse and then the select mouse. So using the action mouse, which in my case is the left mouse button, I can then position the 3D cursor. I can position this 3D cursor from any view and it positions it in space. So for example, if I were to go down to the top view by pressing numpad 7, and then perhaps toggle out of perspective mode with numpad 5, I can then position that anywhere that I wish directly from the top view. You can also see the exact location of the 3D cursor from the properties panel right here. The reason that the 3D cursor is important is it is the location where any new object is added. So for example, if I go to the add menu, choose mesh and circle, it's going to add that circle at the location of the 3D cursor. Now there's any number of other things that you can do around the 3D cursor, such as, for example, I can change the pivot point to be around the 3D cursor. So if I choose the pivot point to be around the 3D cursor, I select my cylinder, and then I press R to rotate. It will now rotate around that 3D cursor. There's any number of other things you can use the 3D cursor with, but those are some of the basics. And so since the 3D cursor is something that is generally very confusing to many new users, I wanted to be sure to go ahead and cover it. But that's enough for the cursor at the time being. Let's go ahead and delete the circle, select the cylinder by right-clicking on it. Let's make sure that its location is zeroed out. So right now you'll notice that it is not centered on the grid. And just for good practice, we do want to go ahead and have it centered on the grid. So remember that we could go ahead and change the location here from the properties panel, or we could simply press Alt-G, and that will reset the origin point, this little dot right here, to 0, 0, 0, or the center and origin of our scene. All right, now let's talk about object mode versus edit mode. So currently we have been in what's known as object mode, as you can see right down here. Object mode is exactly what it sounds like. It is the mode for working with complete objects. But if I wanted to, say, manipulate the actual structure of this cylinder, so I wanted to go in and either add or remove vertices, edges, or faces, then I need to be in what's called edit mode. Edit mode can be accessed via the menu right down here, along with a variety of other modes. So if I just choose edit mode, I can then have access to all of my individual vertices. You'll notice now that a variety of things have changed. Number one, all of my tools over here have changed, as these are all context sensitive. So I now have all of my actual mesh tools, such as translate, rotate, and scale, in addition to shrink and fatten, push and pull, edge slide, noise, smooth, extrude, subdivide, spin, knife, etc. So all of our specific mesh tools, whereas before this showed all of our object tools. So your toolbar is context sensitive based on the mode and the object that you have selected. On the right side in the properties panel, you also notice a few things, such as we now have a new mesh display section, and under the transform section, we also have a crease and bevel and a variety of other things. We're not going to worry about these for the time being, but just be aware that those things do change based on the context that you're currently in. Within the 3D view here, when working with these pieces, we now have the ability to select any one of the edges, vertices, or faces. However, this is a little bit different because by default, we are in vertex selection mode. So if I just right-click on any vertex, right now you'll notice that all of them are selected as they're all highlighted in orange. If I right click or select, so that may be left click for you, if I just select this single vertex, you'll notice that it is now highlighted. The vertex is shown in white, and the connecting edges are then shown fading out in orange to show where it's connected to. I can select any number of vertices simply by holding down Shift. And if I select two connected vertices, you'll notice it selects the edge between them. And if I select all four vertices, or three, or however many vertices make up a single face, then that face will also be selected. If you wish to select, say, just edges at a time, you can go into Edge Select mode right here. And this then allows me to simply select individual edges. Or you can go into Face Select mode with this one and choose each one of the individual faces. As with the manipulators and a variety of other things in Blender, if we want to have multiples of these enabled, simply hold down Shift and you can toggle on any one that you choose. So now I have the ability to select edges, vertices, or a single vertex, or an entire face at any point in time. And this can be very, very beneficial. Next, we've got a variety of our mesh editing tools, such as I showed you over here, and I just want to show you a couple of the primary ones. So first of all, we have the ability to delete or remove any number of things. So for example, if I wanted to delete just this face or the surface, but I wanted to leave the vertices and edges intact, I could simply press the X key or go over here and choose the delete menu and choose delete faces. That will leave the vertices and edges intact and all the surrounding geometry, but it will remove that surface. Same thing, if I wanted to say just delete this edge, I could go in here and delete just the edge. However, if I went in here and I deleted the vertices, it will also remove anything that is attached or relying on that vertex because suddenly that vertex is removed and so it doesn't work. On the other hand, if I wanted to say just delete this edge and the vertices, but not alter the surrounding geometry, then I can use the dissolve function. So from delete and choose dissolve, remembering that you can also access the delete menu via X on your keyboard, I can then choose dissolve. On this edge, you'll notice that nothing happens, but if I bring up the operator panel right here and choose dissolve vertices, it also doesn't do anything. The reason that it doesn't do anything in this case is because I've made an incompatible selection. And this was intentional in this case, so let me make a modification to this mesh to give you a better example. So a very common thing that we'll do with a model is add in a loop cut, or basically add in another set of edges through a continuous set of faces. So this loop cut tool you can find right here, which is loop cut and slide. So if I click loop cut, I can then move my mouse over my mesh and it then highlights in purple the current selection or the current face. So let's just add this right here. If I left click, it then adds in that edge and then automatically puts me in edge slide. Remember, this is called loop cut and slide. And so now I can slide that edge anywhere that I want within this selection. In this case, I'm going to leave it just directly in the center, and so I'll right click. But before I do that, just be aware that many tools that you use in Blender that have modes like this or that are modal tools, such as when you have the active mouse input here, you'll find a variety of settings along here at the bottom of the viewport. So if I wanted to say set this to even, such as all edges would be evenly spaced from this side, then I can just press the E key. If I want to flip which edges or which side that even is based on, then I simply hit F and it will flip to the other side. In this case, I'm just going to leave the edges in the center, and so I'll just right click and it leaves them right there. Now, to go back to the dissolve feature, let's go ahead now with this selection, let's hit X and delete and dissolve. That then is going to immediately remove all of those vertices and edges without altering the surrounding geometry. If I disable remove verts, then it will leave those vertices intact and only dissolve the edges. Now be aware that the dissolve function is a little bit context sensitive. So if I'm in face select mode and I dissolve something, it may behave slightly differently than if I'm in edge select or vertex select mode. So that's just something to be aware of. So those are a variety of things. We've got the delete menu. You can also do a limited dissolve based on the angle, edge collapsing, edge deleting just an edge loop, deleting only faces, only edges and faces, and so on. I'm not going to show you all of these, but just give you some of the basics. So let me now just go into a couple of the other specific tools, one of which is not in here. But first of all, let's go back to face select mode. Let's select our N-gon here at the top of the face, and let's look at extrude. So extrude is a very, very common tool, and you can access it from the toolbar right here with extrude region or extrude individual. The difference is that if I do extrude region with this selection, or if I do extrude individual, they both act exactly the same. However, if I were to select these two faces like this, and I do extrude region, and note that when you do an extrude region, it automatically puts you into move mode and then moves those faces or your newly extruded selection along the normal. So it averages the normal of my current selection and then moves them in that direction. I can then either right click to cancel the movement, or I can left click to then position it. So with extrude region, it just grabs the entire area and extrudes it. If I choose extrude individual, it's going to extrude each individual face on its own and move them along their own individual normal. And so at that point, I can simply press left click and that will position them. Now, what if we wanted to fill this area? So I've extruded, I've duplicated, I've dissolved, but now I have this hole in my model, and if I wanted to fill that, I could simply go into either vertex or edge select mode, and I could select, say, this edge, and this edge, and this edge, and this edge, and I could then choose the fill option. The fill option is actually not listed in the toolbar, but you can find it via here along the bottom. You can find all of the different settings that are available via the mesh menu. Because inside the mesh menu, then we have all of our UV unwrap settings, symmetrize, extrude, etc. And we also have all of our faces, our edges, and our vertices options. Each one of these you can find, Control F will bring up a face menu, Control E for edges, Control V for faces or for vertices. So if I hit Control F, and then choose fill, or which is also accessible via F or Alt F. So for make edge and face and fill, I can just choose make edge or face, and that will then fill in that selection. This would have also worked if I had simply selected these two edges and pressed F. That would also work. Now, the difference between these two, such as fill and make face, is very little in this case. However, if I were to, say, go back into face mode, and I delete this face, so if I hit X and delete that face, and then I want to fill in this entire area, I could go back to edge select mode, I could choose each one of these edges, just by holding down Shift, like this, and then I could either hit F, which would fill it with a single N-gon, or if I hit Alt F, or the fill option, then it will do a beauty fill. Now in this case, it's not an accessible selection because it is closed off, but a beauty fill will generally fill it with either triangles and quads based on the geometry. The majority of the time, you're simply going to use the F key to then fill that, because that will fill based on your selection. If you have more than 4 edges selected, it will fill an N-gon. If you have 3, it'll fill a triangle. If you have 4, it fills a quad. Or if you have only 2 vertices, it will fill an edge. So that's the fill function. But another very, very common tool that we use that also is not shown right here, and why I want to talk about it, is the inset tool. So an inset is when I want to do something like this. So this is a very, very common thing that we need to do in Blender, and you can access it by hitting Control F, and you can find inset faces right here. You can also do it via the hotkey of I as shown on the right side. So if I choose Inset Faces, slide that in, I can then inset it. Inside the operator panel then, you have all of the settings that apply to that operation, which in this case is inset. So then after the fact, I can go in and I can adjust the thickness, or I could input a specific numeric value. I can adjust the depth to move it up or down. I could say that maybe it's going to be an outset instead of an inset. I could choose to select outer, which is the default, or select inner, so it changes the selection. And then one of the most important ones is I can choose whether or not to choose boundary. So if I don't inset the boundary, you'll notice that it ignores this open edge and only insets the surrounding geometry around it. So oftentimes if you're working with a symmetrical model and you create an inset along the inside seam, then you may not want to have boundary enabled. Next, another tool that is very, very common that is not shown right here is the bevel tool, which you probably also saw that you could find it via here, which is just Control B. And if you hit Control B, that then allows you to bevel your current selection. So then just moving your mouse back allows you to bevel it. You can then increase the number of iterations within the bevel simply by increasing your scroll wheel. So doing a few bevels here and then left clicking allows me to change then the offset in the operator panel. I can set the number of segments, or I can even set it to bevel the vertices only. Those are the majority of the primary mesh selection or mesh editing tools. There is, of course, lots of other ones, such as the knife tool, the screw tool, the spin tool, and all the other numerous ones that you can also find from the mesh menu. The main tools that I encourage you to use, or the main menus for looking for tools, are again Control E for edges, Control F for faces, and Control V for vertices. Now, one last thing that I want to show you just real quick that is very, very beneficial before we get into modifiers is the edge slide and vertex slide. So for example, let's just go over to the vertex mode here and let's select these two vertices. So a very common tool when you're tweaking a model is vertex slide and edge slide. So I can access these. For edge slide, I can hit Control E and choose edge slide. And this allows me to then slide this forward and back. You also notice that I have even and flipped down here as well, similar to when I did the loop cut and slide. I can then slide this and just left click to position it. If I have a single vertex selected, I can hit Control V and choose vertex slide right here, which is also Shift V is the hotkey for it specifically. And that then allows me to select a specific edge just by hovering over it for where I want to slide this. But since this is such a common thing to do, both vertex and edge slide, it's a little bit obnoxious to have it buried within a menu like this. So instead, a new shortcut that's been added in Blender 2.66 is if you just double tap G, it will automatically, depending on your selection, put you into vertex slide or edge slide. So if I have an edge selected or a series of edges, and I press G, it will put me into edge slide. If I have a single vertex, or two unconnected vertices, as in not connected by an immediate selection, and I press GG, it will put me into vertex slide. And so this is just a very, very quick way to activate those transforms, allowing you to work with them very, very quickly. Okay, let's go ahead and bounce out of edit mode now, which you can do by just changing the menu here or by pressing Tab. Tab will toggle when you have a mesh selection between edit mode and object mode. Inside object mode, let's just hit X and we're going to delete our object. Let's now reposition our 3D cursor, because remember that determines where our object gets added. So we can either go here to 3D cursor and set this to 0, 0, 0, or we can simply press Shift C, which will recenter the 3D cursor at the origin point. I will now hit Shift A, or go up here to the Add menu and choose Mesh and Cylinder again. Or in this we'll do mesh and cylinder. There we are. And we can now work with modifiers. If you're not familiar with modifiers are basically non-destructive editing functions of sorts that allow us to do all kinds of different things non-destructively. And when I say non-destructively, I mean that they take our initial mesh input and modify that, but they don't actually apply anything, such that at any point, if I want to go back to my mesh selection, change that mesh, and then leave edit mode and have it applied to the modifier, it just works. So you can find the modifiers via the wrench icon right here, and then you can choose Add Modifier. Within the modifiers, we have quite a few, but several of the key ones that I'll show you today are Subdivision Surface and Mirror. Many of you will be familiar with subdivision surfaces, so I'm not going to worry about describing that for the time being. If you're not familiar with it, simply check out Wikipedia for subdivision surface. Choosing subdivision surface will immediately apply that to my model. And you can notice that I have a fairly gnarly result here on the top and on the bottom because I have an N-gon right there. But if I simply were to hit Tab to go into edit mode, go into face select mode, select that face, hold down Shift and select this face, and then hit I to inset, then I can have a very nice selection. There we are. So now I'll hit Tab to leave edit mode again, and now my geometry is much cleaner. So my subdivision surface, as you will have seen here, subdivides my model and smooths it out, but does not, as you can see in edit mode, actually alter the original geometry. And this is true of all modifiers. So here within the subsurf modifier, as is commonly called, I can change the type from Catmull Clark to simple. I can change the number of subdivisions, so I could set that up to say 2 or 3. I can set whether or not to subdivide the UVs of the model, and I can choose optimal display, such that if I switch over here to wireframe mode, it shows my original smoothed out geometry, not the newly created geometry. Next, we've got a few other modifiers that we can use. So for example, maybe I'll use the mirror modifier, and the mirror modifier just allows us to create a symmetrical object without having to model both halves. Now, right now, you'll notice that nothing has happened. And this is because it's currently mirroring on top of itself. So the mirror modifier works around the origin point right here. So if I hit Tab to go into edit mode, and I select everything, which you can do via select, and choose select or deselect all. So deselect, and then select all, which you can also do with the A key. And if I then hit G to go into grab mode, X to lock it to the X-axis, and then just move it over, you can immediately see that I have a symmetrical geometry. So it is mirroring based around the origin point of my model and mirroring it across the X-axis. I could also, if I move this along the Y-axis, I could also enable along the Y and along the Z. In this case, I'm going to undo that with Control Z and position it right there. So the mirror modifier is very, very beneficial for creating things like faces, characters, and any other symmetrical model. Now, one thing to note with modifiers is that they work in a stack. So when I first add the subsurf modifier, it reads my data here. It reads my original mesh. When I add the mirror modifier, it takes the output of the subdivision surface modifier and then inputs that into the mirror. And this is why it works in a stack. It works from top down. So first it applies the subsurf, then it applies the mirror, and then any other modifiers that I have. So if you get awkward results because one modifier is getting the output from another modifier that maybe is not optimal, then you can simply move your modifiers up and down using your arrow keys here. So if I just move this one up, it'll move to the top. And so the mesh data is first getting sent to the mirror modifier, then the output of the mirror modifier gets sent to the subsurf modifier, so forth and so on. And so we've got all of the different modifiers that we can add right in here. I'm not going to worry about introducing any of the others to you, but they're there if you want them. The last thing to note is with your modifiers is that you can go ahead and copy or apply them. So if I decide that I want to work on both halves of this model independently and no longer rely on the modifier, I can simply click apply, and now it's made that geometry real, such that if I hit Tab to go into edit mode, now I have two distinct halves to my model that, although they match exactly at the moment, are no longer actually linked and are independent of one another. So that's the basics of modifiers and mesh editing, mesh selection, and object mode and edit mode in Blender. That's it for the modeling section. There is, of course, many more things that we can talk about, which would be a good time to jump into any of our other modeling tutorials or join in for the Citizen program for a lot of the in-depth courses on introduction to modeling and whatnot. But for the time being, it's ready to jump right over to the animation system.